With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good Tuesday evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics, whether you're watching on Facebook Live, on YouTube, on Twitch, on Twitter, Periscope, terrestrial signal. You have no excuse for not watching the show because we're on virtually every medium known to mankind, except for the Apple ones, but that's only because they're super complicated. But anyway, thank you so much for being with us. We certainly do appreciate you making us a part of your day here at Tactics in the Situation Room, where speech is not violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. We appreciate you being with us, and we do have quite a bit of local news to get to that I do want to hash out, and a lot of it has to do with Doug Jones, because for those of you who may not know, he is seeking re-election. Wait, where's all the screaming crowds? Where's the gasp and awe? I'm looking out at my studio audience, and by studio audience, I mean the blank wall behind me, and I'm not seeing any of that. The blank wall is about as responsive as everyone else was to this announcement. Not to take a swing at Doug Jones, I would have said exactly the same thing if Richard Shelby had announced that he was going in for re-election, just like he did last time. It's not a surprise. Because, first of all, the guy has been fundraising for over a year now. I mean, he's been in full re-election mode since basically the day he took office. And we've done story after story here about him advertising, campaigning. We've even talked about how in some of his re-election bids, some of his re-election fundraising emails and correspondence, that he specifically targeted people outside Alabama, and the vast majority, an overwhelming majority, of the money that he has raised has come from outside the state of Alabama, some of it even from other countries. And so the fact that he's building this war chest, and we've been watching him do this basically since he took office, it should surprise absolutely nobody that he's going to get reelected. I mean, that would be like buying a car and never driving it anywhere. I guess you could do it, but if you drive a car, people kind of expect you to, or if you purchase a car, people kind of expect you to drive it or at least ride around in it. And so he announced it last week. It doesn't surprise anybody. It's barely news. But I do find the whole thing kind of funny. I know that it's a formality to actually officially announce that you're running for re-election, that you're officially running and seeking out the nomination from your party. I get that it's a formality thing. I'm not picking at Doug Jones specifically, nor other politicians, because I know they got to do it. It's just, like a lot of other formalities, just seems kind of silly. Seems kind of like you don't really need it. I've always thought of it, and I've used this analogy before, that would be like announcing that you're about to announce something and announce that whatever it is that you're announcing, what it actually is. And I know that was super confusing, and that's because the logic behind these formal announcements are also super confusing. What I mean by that is it would be like saying, we'll use the buying the car thing. I just wanted to let you all know that tomorrow at 2 o'clock, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to buy a car. Like, well, you just told us that you're going to buy a car. You just told us what you're going to announce, so there's no point doing the announcement. But anyway, so I say all that to say, yeah, Doug Jones is running for re-election, and directly after that goes on the program Capital Journal, which airs right here in the state of Alabama. It's done by Alabama Public Television. And he goes on there to discuss the gun violence and gun control. And that's what he spent really the entirety of the interview on. So, by the way, hat tip to Jeff Poor for posting this video so other people could see it. Jeff Poor, of course, is one of our correspondents for our Huntsville affiliate, WVNN. And so that we're all in one big happy family. We appreciate him going through and actually taking the whole interview and putting it on YouTube so that we could use it. So here's the first clip of Doug Jones talking about the Dickey Amendment. And I'm going to, as usual, as is par for the course for this program, I'm going to try to be as objective as possible. And when Doug Jones says something that I agree with, I want to go ahead and acknowledge that. So here is the first part of this interview with Doug Jones talking about gun control.
So I think there are measures that we can do. And I think mental health is a part of that. One of the things I want to emphasize when I get back to Washington is the fact that we need to let the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, actually do some studies about gun violence in this country. For years, there was an amendment to a bill called the Dickey Amendment that prohibited the CDC from looking at gun violence. We removed that last year after the Parkland shooting, but we didn't fund it. I think it's time to fund it. If people believe that mental health is a part of this, and I believe it is too, by the way, but it's only a part, we need to let the CDC do the same thing that they've done for automobile violence, for automobile wrecks, for products liability, those kind of things that we have spent millions and millions of dollars on that have saved lives. Let the CDC look. I think that's an important part of this debate that's going to be going forward, and I think that is one area that we can find some common ground on.
All right, so first of all, we're going to start with the good. I give Doug Jones credit where credit is due. A lot of the Democrats want to completely ignore the mental health aspect of it. They want to completely write that off. They want to say that anybody that's talking about that's just an excuse for them to protect guns and protect their ability to own guns. So I appreciate Doug Jones at the very least not doing that. Whether he wanted to or not, whether that was really his intention or not, I'm not sure. But regardless, I give him credit where credit is due. He did do that and did it correctly. So, at least 1 point on his roster for that. The reason behind the Dickey Amendment, though, and to really understand any law, you need to understand the intention behind it. The reason behind the Dickey Amendment was not to treat evil or crime like an epidemic. That was sort of the thinking, is that because the Center for Disease Control treats things like epidemics, in other words, illnesses, that kind of thing, what we don't want to do is we don't want them reporting on guns, because then people will treat gun crimes, violent crimes, muggings, robberies like it's some kind of social disease. And it is a social disease in the sense that it is a disease that society has caught, but it's not a disease in the sense that it's something that you just catch. It's not a disease in the sense that it's something that is just a happenstance of nature. See, what's going on here is there are people, a lot of people, mostly the ones on Doug Jones' side, that want to write off all kinds of problems as though they're something that, well, that's just the way that society is. And what I mean by that is just to get the idea that what has happened is those people aren't really making bad decisions. They're not really in control of their own actions. It's their circumstances that are doing this. So in other words, they were too poor, or they didn't get a good education, or they were angry because they didn't have the newest iPhone, whatever it was, they'll say it's not really their fault. And some of them will come out and say that outright. Some of them will try to dance around it and basically say, well, poverty is the issue or whatever. But the point is, a lot of people on the left don't want to blame the person. They want to blame the fact that the person had access to guns and they were in a bad situation. And so it's an excuse to not blame the person or not blame the actions. Look, some of these mass shooters have been exactly fitting the bill of what they're talking about. Poor people that are lonely, that got radicalized through some group or just went crazy. But there's also some people, like the Las Vegas shooter, that guy was clean as a whistle as far as not having a previous record, and was an older person and was very wealthy. And so you can't just chalk it all up to societal woes as to where these mass shootings, where they're coming from and why they're doing the things that they do. And so that was the reason, the rationale behind the Dickey Amendment. Whether you agree with it or not, and honestly, I have some misgivings about the Dickey Amendment, that was the reason that it was put forward, because they didn't want people treating evil actions by individuals, choices that they made as though it was just an epidemic that can't be helped, like the common cold or cancer or chickenpox or something like that. And so if you understand that's the background of where it's coming from, it makes a lot more sense why they did not want this to take place. They did not want the CDC looking into it specifically. However, I think that this is where a lot of conservatives go wrong in treating it just like a mental health issue. They kind of weirdly enough adopt the same argument that the Democrats are doing by saying, oh, well, it's specifically mental health. That's the only thing we should worry about. We shouldn't talk about any of the other issues. They almost make the same argument because if it is just a mental health issue, well, then the gun debate is essentially boiled down to a disease. It's something that the person can't help, that they don't have control of their faculties. It's just a happenstance of nature. That's not a good place for the gun debate to go either. And so I think a lot of people on the right, weirdly enough, make exactly the same mistake as people on the left do, just in a different direction. They're trying to make the case that, well, this isn't really that person. Here's the hard truth, and this is unpopular and people don't like to hear it. There are evil people in this world, and they are going to continue to do evil. There will always be a small portion of the population that wants to do bad. If there are proposals to try to prevent that as much as possible and protect people, I am all for hearing them. But always be skeptical of anyone that says, well, if we just implement this policy, these things will go away completely. That's not how it works. There will always be evil, bad people that you can't prevent from doing evil. Doesn't mean we stop trying. Doesn't mean we don't do everything in our power, and by everything in our power I mean as individuals, to try to ensure that that doesn't take place in the future, and sometimes that includes government policies or laws to put on the books. But the point is, to be realistic in approaching this issue or any issue, we have to accept the fact that people are going to make bad decisions that hurt other people. I'm not saying that we're okay with it, but to look at the world honestly is to accept that reality. And here's the thing about what he's talking about. I am not against more research on gun violence. Never have been. I love research. You guys know I'm a stats and data guy. Anytime I can get my hands on an honest broker, somebody that is actually looking for the truth and looking at their findings when it comes to this or any other issue, I am all for it. And in fact, the CDC specifically, to my knowledge, the only study they actually have done on gun violence, do you know what it showed? It showed that defensive uses of firearms, DUFs, were anywhere between 25 and 80 times more likely to occur than gun violence. We've gone over that study probably 100 times. I've done all kinds of videos on gun control in the past. There was one I did just recently on Andrew Yang, so you can go in the, I think that one's a daily dose of stupid, so you could look for that one. But yeah, if you look that one up, we go over some of these statistics that it showed, and showed that Andrew Yang's claim in that was completely wrong, and actually defensive use of firearms are incredibly common when compared to acts of gun violence. So the one time that the CDC actually did do some research into gun violence, it wound up looking incredibly favorable for the law-abiding gun carrier. So yeah, I have no problem with more research being done on that. I want as much data to look at as possible, but here's the thing. I think the reason that this was put into place, and the reason a lot of people liked the Dickey Amendment, is because the truth is there are a lot of Republicans that don't believe what they're selling. They don't really believe that guns make people safer. There are a lot of true believers on this issue when it comes to Republicans. I think this is one of the few areas where there are some establishment Republicans that really do believe that. But there are some Republicans that are scared of what the research will find. I have faith in my belief system. I support the Second Amendment not because I think that it's just something that I want, but because I actually believe it works better and that an armed society is a politer society and one that is more immune to evil. And because of that, I believe the stats will back up that belief. I'm not afraid of more data. There are some Republicans that are. And while a lot of Republicans probably supported the Dickey Amendment for the original intent that I just gave you, I believe that there were at least some, if not more, that really just didn't have faith that the data was going to bear out what they already believed. They were afraid that instead of confirming what they believed, that it was going to show the opposite, and because of that, they didn't want to deal with it. There were probably some Republicans that opposed getting rid of the Dickey Amendment because of that. But either way, I have faith in my argument. The only issue that I would come up with here is that even though I wouldn't be opposed to more research, I'm opposed to the CDC doing it. Not because they're the CDC, but because they're the federal government. All in favor of more research being done on this. But it should be handled at the private level, because I not only don't want the CDC researching this, I don't want the CDC researching anything, really. I see no reason for the CDC to exist. A lot of this stuff could be handled at the state level. There's no reason for the Fed to be engaged in these long research tirades. I mean, the CDC just looks at data that the state gathers anyway and compiles it. So I don't see why a state-led organization or one particular state that does the research and compiles the data couldn't handle this. The fact is the CDC is unconstitutional, therefore it shouldn't exist. And so, yes, I am against funding it, which is what Doug Jones suggested here, but that has nothing to do with me being afraid of what they'll find. It has a lot to do with me being mostly a libertarian when it comes to these issues, and by every measure, a staunch, strict federalist when it comes to the 10th Amendment. So that's really where that comes from. But I don't want what Doug Jones is talking about, and that is for this to be treated as though it's something like car accidents, because there's a couple reasons. First of all, you don't have a right to a car. It's a completely different scenario. A car is nice to have, but it is a God-given right, and to really effectively use an automobile, you have to use the public roadways, bridges, that kind of thing, which is the reason that we have licensing, the reason we have safety precautions. I don't want the CDC doing what they have done to automobile manufacturers and mandating things from on high. Now, if the state wants to mandate things to a car company, that's one thing. But having a federal government do it is already unconstitutional. And now they're trying to apply that same logic to something that's actually a constitutional right. That's not going to end well. Because first of all, anything that the CDC would be empowered to do to set safety precautions for guns, whatever that would look like, I have no idea. I have a feeling I know where the direction that it would go to pretty quickly, especially under a Democrat president. But the point is, when you're looking at it that way, I don't want them dictating on high to gun manufacturers the way that they have to make their guns. That is not going to end well, for a myriad of different reasons. Let's go ahead and look at this second clip by Doug Jones.
Dating back to the El Paso, Texas, Dayton, Ohio shootings of several weeks ago, we've heard renewed talk of stricter background checks, but it seems to go back and forth. Where are you on stricter background checks?
Well, I'm in favor of stricter background checks. I think the reason it's going back and forth is because no one is focused strictly on background checks themselves. Every side, again, when you mention certain things, they go to corners, and people on one side want to put in more, people on another side want to take away more, and so you get the background checks alone stuck in the middle and nothing gets done.
Okay, so a couple things on that. First of all, Doug Jones is not entirely wrong on the fact that when you mention something, as human beings, we tend to go to our corners and start getting ready for a fight instead of actually listening to the other person. And I don't want to do that. I am not intrinsically opposed to quote-unquote stronger background checks. The question is, what do those stronger background checks look like? Because right now, the way that it is at this moment, you cannot purchase a firearm without going through a criminal background check. And if they throw your name in the database and it pops up that you have a felony, you have some kind of violent offense in your past, they don't let you buy the gun. So my only issue here is, what does that stronger background check look like? What does a stronger background check mean for me, the citizen that's just trying to exercise his constitutional right? Because I've not heard a good answer for that. And if Doug Jones wants to get specific and what he says measures up to that, then I'm fine with a stronger background check that would prevent criminals from getting their hands on firearms. But if it is going to impede the citizen, then I cannot get behind it. I'm open to hearing his suggestions. If he has a suggestion that would do that, by all means, fire away, Senator Jones. As much as I disagree with you on most things, I will support you in that endeavor if that's what you actually come up with. But every single proposal for stronger background checks that I've heard doesn't do that. All the ones that I've heard would make it illegal to borrow a firearm or to sell a firearm to somebody unless you had some kind of registry. So that's really the issue that I'm running into, is that most proposals either include a national registry to check it against, and or, depending on who you're talking to, which proposal you're talking about, making private gun sales illegal, or to where you had to undergo some kind of background check in order to transfer said firearm. That is not going to work. That's not something that I can get on board with. If you mean something else by a stronger background check and something that would, actually work, okay, I can hear your proposal. But until then, Senator Jones, you're going to have to actually do a little bit more to get me behind you other than just saying stronger background checks. That's a blanket term that doesn't mean anything. Tell me what that actually looks like, and then I'll consider your proposal. Here's that next clip.
Do you agree with the contention that has been raised during this debate that background checks may not have prevented a lot of these?
It may not have, but you know what? It's not necessarily that's where people get focused on the news of the day. Perhaps they wouldn't have prevented something that happened in the last month. But if what happened in the last month lets us do something that will prevent others in the future, and other violence, there's no question that additional background checks will stop people from getting their hands on guns, getting guns in the wrong hand.
All right, so one thing I wanted to point out is I love that little Freudian slip there at the end. He says the additional background checks will keep people from getting their hands on guns, which I believe is the actual intent here. What he's actually trying to do is keep people from getting guns. Not criminals. People. Citizens. You. The law-abiding citizen. I think that actually is the end goal, and I think that there may have been a little bit of a Freudian slip there by Senator Jones saying, well, this is going to keep people from getting guns. Well, yeah, that's what we're afraid of, Senator Jones. But anyway, whether that's actually what it was or not, here's the issue. They talk out of both sides of their mouths when they do this. Because he said, well, what do you make of this contention that, well, these proposals wouldn't have prevented these mass shootings? And Doug Jones says, well, this is where you get caught up in the news of the day. Whether or not this would have prevented this particular shooting or a shooting that happened in the last month, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. You see, but I thought that was the whole point of pass it now. You remember in the wake of each of these mass shootings, what they kept saying is, well, the time is over. We need to go ahead and pass it now. Let's pass it quickly. The reason that they're doing that is they're afraid that your common sense is going to kick in. They want you to pass it when you're emotional, when you're at a fever pitch, essentially. That's the opportune time for them to pass gun control legislation because you're not thinking clearly. All of us have experience with people who don't make good decisions. And what do they have in common? Normally, they make those bad decisions when they're very emotional. When you're not emotional, when you're thinking with your logic and your reason in the driver's seat, you tend to not make bad decisions as often. Sure, it happens, but you're far more likely to make a hasty or rash decision when you're in a hurry. That's why they call it a hasty or rash decision. Those are bad things. Those are things we don't want to do. And it's the reason our government is designed the way that it is. So that you can't turn on a dime, so that one person, one emperor can't just change the law on a whim. It's clunky and slow by design. So that people have to take a step back, take a breath, and think, I don't know, is this really a good idea? I thought it was a week ago when a mass shooting just happened, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe there are some unforeseen consequences that could occur based on this legislation that we're not thinking about right now. See, that's what they're trying to prevent. And what's hilarious to me is that with one breath, they'll say, no, we got to pass it now. We got to do it right now. We have to do it right now, right this second, while everybody is all whipped up into a frenzy and everybody's emotional about the most recent mass shooting. And then they say, well, yeah, but the law that you're proposing wouldn't have prevented this mass shooting. They're like, well, you can't focus on that one event. You see the double standard there? They changed their story based on how you're talking to them at the moment, and Doug Jones is no exception. Furthermore, even if that were not the case, he's completely wrong. He's not even in the same ballpark as what is actually correct, because he says, oh, there's no doubt whatsoever that these background checks and these proposals that I'm putting forward, that it would prevent gun crimes from taking place. Here's the problem with that, though. There has never been a study anywhere in the world that showed a gun control law actually brought down gun crime and gun violence. Not one. Ever. And you would think that if it was so obvious that, like Doug Jones is saying, well, there's no doubt. You can't find one? You can't find one conclusive point where you're saying, yeah, these guys enacted this gun control law, and look, gun violence went down. You would think if it were so easy and so obvious that they could provide a source like that, but they can't. And you notice that Doug Jones does not cite an example there. Where you can look at, for example, England. What happened as soon as England started putting gun control in place in their country? Well, crime in the UK actually went up. It skyrocketed for about a year to a half, and then it leveled off and continued on the same downward trend that it had been for decades. In America, states invoke different gun control laws all the time. And you know what? Their violent crime rates and their gun crime rates remain pretty much on par. There's no correlation between an increase in law enforcement when it comes to gun control and a decrease in crime. You have some very high crime areas that have high gun ownership. Unfortunately, if you're looking per capita, Alabama happens to be in that particular wing. But then you also have states with very high gun ownership that have practically no crime at all. And the reverse is true. States that have high gun control, there's some that have very little crime. There's some that have an awful lot of crime. And so there's no correlation there. You can look at New Zealand. You remember that New Zealand, after the Christchurch shooting, they invoked all kinds of new gun control laws and did it very quickly, very hastily. Yeah, gun crime hasn't gone down there. They'll try to bring up Australia. And the reason that they'll bring up Australia is they'll say, see, the gun crime rate actually went down and the violent crime rate actually decreased after they started gun control in the 90s. Yeah, it did. Here's the problem with that. It was already on a downward trajectory, and so was the United States. Australia put gun control in place, and theirs continued along the same path it was beforehand. America, at least nationwide, did not evoke a massive gun control between after the assault weapons ban wore off after the Clinton administration, and gun manufacturing skyrocketed, and we saw the same downward trajectory in the United States. And so it had no observable effect anywhere. And if you would think if it were so obvious that this would help prevent crime, if it were so easy to prove that Doug Jones could find at least one example of it, but he never does. And here's where he messes up in this. He's like, well, it's not about the news of the day. Maybe it wouldn't prevent something that happened last month, but there's no doubt whatsoever that overall it would prevent it. Here's the issue with that one. You remember back in the presidential debates, there was a line where Marco Rubio said that over the past 20 years, no gun legislation that was presented, that was put up and tried to get through the House or through the Senate, would have prevented the event that they were put up to try to stop. And Washington Post, which is not exactly a right-leaning news source, did a fact check on him and had to give him a Geppetto. In other words, they couldn't find anything incorrect in what he was saying. They went through, and I read the report, they went through each individual one and the legislation that correlated with it. Not a single one would have prevented it. So, Doug Jones, if it's so incredibly obvious, and this is going to stop mass shootings, this is going to stop gun crimes, well then, why is it that you can't find one example? Even Washington Post fact checker can't find one example of that actually working. It seems to me like there's an awful lot of doubt that it would, if you ask me, there's no doubt that it would do nothing. All of the data is on the side of the Second Amendment. You may not like that. It may get into the way of your policy proposals, but at the end of the day, this is one of those issues where all the data is on the side of gun advocates. There are a lot of arguments where I kind of see the other side's point, or there is some data that backs up their point, but I think that there's data or more data that backs up my side. This is not one of those issues. The data is overwhelmingly on the side of making guns readily available to the citizens and doing so protecting their God-given rights to self-defense, ultimately being a benefit to society at large. Let's go ahead and look at the next clip here. Okay, I'm waiting for that one to load, so while we are, I'll go ahead and do this last one. So, on this issue, there are 3 reasons why criminals get their hands on guns. The first is that they had no previous record. In other words, they went through a background check, but there was nothing in their background that would suggest that they needed to not get guns. This was the case for the Louisiana theater shooter and Dayton, Ohio. So in other words, they did buy their guns legally and they did go through the background check process, but there was nothing in their record that suggested that they needed to not have guns, and so they let them have the guns. The second is that they obtained it illegally. This is the way that it was in San Bernardino, Aurora, Colorado, and Sandy Hook. So in this case, the guns were not purchased legally, that they got them through some other means. They either stole them from somebody else or they purchased them from an illegal straw buyer, somebody that buys guns specifically to sell them to criminals in the black market. So when we're looking at this one, that was the way that those were obtained in those ones. These are the more common ones when it comes to terrorism and acts of Islamic terror. Usually, if that's the case, this is how they got it. They obtained the guns illegally. And then the third one is government incompetence. In other words, they did go through a background check and they did purchase their guns legally, but the system failed. And this is the case in Parkland, this is the case in El Paso, that there were warning signs, but law enforcement officials did not do their job. They didn't follow the procedure or the policy, and because of that, they wound up getting a gun even though they shouldn't have. You notice anything about those 3? In none of those cases would a new gun control law prevent them from getting a firearm. None of them. Because if the government's incompetent, then it doesn't matter what law you put into place, people are still going to fall through the cracks. And if it's somebody that just didn't have anything in his previous record, like the Las Vegas shooter that we just talked about, well then it doesn't matter how airtight your gun control laws are. If they've not committed any crimes, that's not going to prevent them from getting a firearm legally. The only way to stop that is to stop all sales of guns. The only way you could do that is to completely infringe upon the right of the law-abiding citizen to own a firearm. And then the other one, obtaining the guns illegally, I think that one's pretty obvious. If you're obtaining the gun legally, then whatever law is put into place doesn't make any difference. And so this is the issue that we're really running into. That none of the gun control laws would have prevented these events because the way that they get guns are not prevented by these laws. Laws affect the law-abiding, not the criminals. And that seems to be the sticking point in a lot of these arguments. Let's go ahead to Jones' 4th point here.
Because the goal here is not just these mass shootings. You know, Donna, we lose 40,000 Americans a year to gun. When a gun discharges, 40,000 Americans die. About 24,000 of those are from suicides. That's not just a mental health issue. That's an access to gun issue. So many of them are done on a spur of the moment. It's a training issue. There's a lot of things that we can do to save lives, and that's the goal, to save lives.
Now, here's another case of Doug Jones being completely wrong. There's nothing correct in that particular clip. Because when it comes to suicides, yes, a lot of people in America commit suicide via guns. And one thing that Jones just pointed out that actually works as an argument against what he's talking about is that access to guns isn't going to prevent those suicides. How do I know? Because you would have to show some correlation between an excess of gun ownership and an excess of suicides. When it comes to guns, there is no question that America is king. We have the most guns by a lot, way more than the next country. In fact, we have more guns than people. Our gun ownership rate is about 120. And the second place win is a little over 60. So they've got roughly half. And that's the second place country. And then there's a big drop off between that and the next first world country, which is Canada at 34. So they've got 34 guns for every 100 people. We have 120 guns for every 100 people. So you can see pretty quickly if guns are causing suicide, if there is a increased risk of suicides because you have guns, then obviously America should have way more suicides than everybody else. It shouldn't even be close. But here's the problem. If you're looking at suicide rates, America is not first. They're not second. They're not third. They're not fourth. They're not 10th. They're not 20th. We're 27th on the world stage. And you know who's ahead of us? A lot of third world nations, sure. But you've also got Austria, France, Japan, Albania. I mean, all kinds of nations. And what do they have in common? They all have a lot less guns and a lot more gun control laws than the United States. And so if gun laws and gun control prevented suicides, well, you would think that all the nations that have more of it than the United States would be way better at suicide rates. But in Japan, owning a firearm is practically impossible. And yet, they have one of the highest suicide rates in the world. Look, the simple fact is, if you want to commit suicide, there's not a whole lot people can do to stop you in the terms of a government. Your friends and family can, sure. And if you're talking about on an individual basis, even as much of an advocate of gun freedom as I am, if I knew that a friend of mine was suicidal, I'd do the best that I could to get his guns taken away because I don't want him to hurt himself. And I'm not talking about getting the government involved. I'm saying I would try to get with his family or people that care about him and try to get those removed then. That might prevent that one specific suicide. But removing guns as a whole from a society that is not suicidal isn't going to do anything to prevent suicides on the whole. And the data bears that out. That's the reason that we're 27th in suicide rate, even though we're first by a wide margin when it comes to gun ownership. There is no correlation between the two. And what Doug Jones is saying here, that getting rid of these guns and putting gun control in place and restricting access to guns is going to help our suicide rate, there's simply no reason to believe that if you're looking at the numbers. So let's go ahead and look at the last clip, which is by far the worst, of Doug Jones in this interview.
And there's a couple things that we know that do not work. We can look and see what doesn't work. And frankly, one of them is blaming this on mental health. That just doesn't work because we blamed that for a long time. The second thing is we've given a lot of thoughts and prayers over the years for these victims and families, and it ain't working. As a religious nation as we are, as a Christian nation and state as we are, those thoughts and prayers just don't seem to be working like they should. So we need to get down and do our work. The Lord can take care of his business if we can do ours.
Yeah, you know who else said that? You know who else was like, oh, clearly, prayer's not working? The Jewish elders that murdered Christ. Now, I'm not saying that Doug Jones saying this is the equivalent to that. Don't get me wrong or take me out of context. But that's the same argument. The argument that he's making there is, well, clearly, we're not having no mass shootings. The mass shootings haven't been reduced to zero, so clearly, it's not working. That was never the purpose of the prayers in the first place. In the same way that the Jewish elders, when they were looking upon Christ, said, oh, well, if he's really the Son of God, just have him ask God to bring him down off the cross. See, he's not really the Son of God. You're missing the point, just like they were. You're missing the purpose of prayer. When somebody sees one of these horrific events, and says their thoughts and prayers go out to them and actually follow up on it and pray, they're not praying for no mass shootings to ever occur. They're not praying for all bad things to be prevented. That would be like saying, well, I prayed for you to be cured of cancer last night, and the doctors say you've still got cancer, so obviously the thoughts and prayers aren't working. That's not the way that prayer works. You don't get an instantaneous answer, and you don't always get the answer that you want. I mean, Jesus Christ himself had a prayer request that was not answered the way that he wanted it to be. He asked to be spared the pain of the cross, and God said to him, no. Even though he was perfect, even though he had done everything that he asked. So what's going on here is not that the thoughts and prayers aren't working, because that's what Doug Jones is saying. He's like, you know what doesn't work? Thoughts and prayers. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to comfort the family. The purpose is to get through these events, not to prevent them from happening. That's not what people are praying about. I mean, I pray that we don't see as many of these events, sure, but I don't think that God is going to magically stop all bad people from doing bad things or hurting other people. I mean, if he wanted to do it, he could, but he's had about 6,000 plus years of human history to do it and hasn't done it yet, so I'm pretty sure he's not going to do that. And there's scripture to back that up as well. You're completely missing the point of thoughts and prayers. Thoughts and prayers were never intended to be a solution to mass shootings. They're intended to comfort the family and help them to look to God for guidance and strength, and to be with us as a nation and how we react to it. And the worst possible reaction is to defy God based on that. To defy the inalienable right of self-defense that God instilled in all human beings, that he intended for all people, which again is backed up by Scripture. That's the worst thing that you can do. In the same way that seeing somebody that says something that you disagree with, the worst thing that you could do is trample upon their God-given freedoms of free speech. Even if it's something that blasphemes against God, you still don't take away their God-given rights just to prove a point. And that's what is being proposed here. Doug Jones just standing up in front of people saying, you know what, your prayers don't matter. It is such an arrogant, hedonistic way to talk about a sincerely issued prayer. If we want to turn this around, if we do want to do something that actually might prevent future mass shootings, prayer is the thing that we're missing the most. If we teach people to pray and think, in other words, use their reason, use their logic, not allow their emotions to govern their life, and first and foremost, more important than that, that they are a creation of an almighty Father that loves them and thinks of them as important and thinks of their fellow man as important, that's what's going to stop future mass shootings. Probably not going to stop all of them. I mean, people have been doing evil since the beginning of time, and they're going to continue to do it. But if you want to look at a solution that might actually work, that might actually make this a less common event, teach people to think and pray. That will be the way to move forward. That will be the way that we teach people to move away from thinking about only themselves and being bundled up in this essentially a cocoon of darkness where they believe that people's lives don't matter and therefore it's okay to shoot them. Teach them a respect for human life that only comes from believing that you are a creation of a unique creator and that everybody else is too, and that everybody's life matters to him. That's going to be something that actually changes this. Doug Jones' snide remarks and policy proposals aren't going to do that. And he's welcome to come on this program anytime and prove me wrong. You have a standing invitation, Senator Jones. Anytime you want to be on this microphone, I'll be happy to meet with you. I think that, if anything, This shows that Abortion Jones knows about as much about prayer as I do about nuclear physics, which is pretty much nothing. But this should surprise nobody. Jones, in this interview, tries to come off as a moderate, tries to come off as a reasonable person that is looking at the data, looking at the situation, and trying to come up with something reasonable. He's not. This is a guy that was endorsed by Moms Demands Action. Now, who is Moms Demand Action? They're a group that is funded by Everytown for gun safety. They're all under that umbrella group. They're one of the subsidiaries of that larger group, Everytown for gun safety, which is the biggest anti-gun advocacy group in the country. And by the way, they spend far more money on individuals and campaigns than the NRA does. It's anywhere from 4 to 5 times as much more. And what's fascinating about that is that this is the same group that another one of their affiliate groups, the March for Our Lives, the one that was kind of started in the wake of Parkland, that's the same group that just last week proposed a policy that included red flag laws. It also included a national registry, an assault weapons ban, and mandatory buybacks. Think about that. Red flag laws, which completely flip the justice system on its head, or at least every one that I've seen and the ones that they're talking about do, where at the slightest hint that maybe in the future somebody might commit a crime involving a gun, we just run in and take their guns away, and they have to prove to us why they're allowed to have it back. They have to prove to the almighty government that you should have your God-given rights. You have to explain to us why you're allowed to have those. It's the exact opposite of the way a right is supposed to work. And then you've also got the other laws, the National Registry, which obviously completely defeats the purpose of the Second Amendment. Because if the government knows exactly where all the guns are and who has them, then it's not very hard for them to disarm us. The whole point of the Second Amendment is to oppose a tyrannical government. It would be impossible to do that if guns were registered. Then, of course, you've got the assault weapons ban, the one that was put in the 90s. This seems to be a more severe version of it. We obviously know what that one's about. And then there's the mandatory gun buybacks. Now, they add the buyback because it sounds as though it's not as big a deal, or that, it's just the government buying it. First of all, the taxpayer burden on that would be insane, because if we're talking about quote-unquote assault weapons, it would be the more expensive guns. So even if we severely lowball it and think that the average price of the gun, the AR-15 rifles, that kind of thing, if we severely lowball it and say that the government would have to spend about $1,000 a gun, think about that. That's $117 billion. Because they said, in their own words, this is in their proposal, that their goal is to get rid of 30% of America's guns. That's what they want to do. And that's not me editorializing, that's in their report. These are the same people that endorsed Doug Jones as the senator. And how did Doug Jones react to this? He said that he was incredibly proud to receive that endorsement. Said it to them because he was speaking at one of their events. Don't let Doug Jones fool you. He is a radical gun grabber, or at the very least is in bed with them, and is willing to do their bidding. And this brings me to somebody else that I don't trust on guns, and that is President Trump. Now, I know a lot of people are really surprised by this, but the truth is, President Trump's record on guns has been pretty bad. Really bad, actually. I mean, certainly better than Hillary would have been, but he keeps doing this waffling act where he keeps going back and forth on the Second Amendment on different things. He actually just, with the stroke of his pen, didn't even go through Congress to get rid of bump stocks. And when it comes to these new proposals that we're sort of hearing whispers of, different reports inside the administration, do you know what they're looking at right now? Right now, the new proposal coming from the White House, not from Congress, not from the House, not from a Democrat, from President Trump's administration, is to put forward a red flag law, which Trump has already publicly advocated for. And they're saying the way that they're going to enforce the red flag law is to use Google Home, Amazon Echo, Fitbit, and Apple Watch. And so what they're planning on doing is monitoring your heart rate, monitoring your health, and also monitoring the things that you're saying in the privacy of your own home, and using that to determine whether or not you can be trusted with a gun. This is full-on totalitarianism. When the government can monitor you and decide that, no, you don't really need your rights. You don't really need those because obviously you can't be trusted. And what kills me about this is, at least in 1984, the novel by George Orwell, at least then the government put your telescreen in the apartment or in your dwelling for you and then monitored you and forced you to do so. What we're doing is we are buying the cameras and mics that the government now wants to use to spy on us and oppress us and take our rights away from us. We're paying for it, and then we're paying for the service that they're using to spy on us. If we walk out of the apartment or walk out of the house without our phone, we go back to get it. We're not just allowing surveillance, we're encouraging it. And if the government does go through with this, it will be President Trump's administration that effectively killed the Second Amendment. I'm not saying this because I hate Trump or I'm trying to undermine his re-election bid or anything like that. This is above politics. We have got to get this right, because if we don't, we will lose our freedom forever. And if President Trump goes down this road, there will be very little that will stop it. I think that the only appropriate response to this, I'm running out of time at this point anyway, but we'll go ahead and look at we'll go ahead and go to the Daily Dose of Stupid and then straight to the Chaplain's Report, because I've got another story that I want to share with you.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
All right, and today's Daily Dose of Stupid comes to us via Kamala Harris. So this was something that she said a couple days ago, ran out of time, didn't get a chance to cover it. So this is Kamala Harris talking about her proposal as president at their town hall.
But now more questions for Senator Kamala Harris. So let's go straight to an audience question now. Carolyn Corson is a lawyer from New York, Senator. She has a question about the impact of certain foods on the environment. Just to give some context here, the United Nations says that livestock cattle, contribute 14.5% of all human-produced greenhouse gases, which is an incredible number. Caroline, go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Climate change has been linked to agriculture and the overconsumption of red meat and also the overproduction of crops. Certain countries have changed their dietary guidelines to reduce the consumption of red meat in light of the impact of the climate change.
Yeah.
If elected, will you be supporting change in dietary guidelines? And then how will you plan on implementing the changes so that people effectively change their diets?
Yeah, I mean, and thank you, Carol, for your work and the question. I think of the point that you're raising in a broader context, which is that as a nation, we actually have to have a real priority at the highest level of government around what we eat and in terms of healthy eating, because we have a problem in America. And we can talk about all that we are now, the subject of this conversation. We can talk about the amount of sugar in everything. We could talk about soda. We could go on and on. So the answer is yes. But I'll also say this, the balance that we have to strike here frankly, is about what government can and should do around creating incentives and then banning certain behaviors. I mean, just to be very honest with you, I love cheeseburgers from time to time, right? I mean, I just do. And I think that, but there has to be also what we do in terms of creating incentives that we will eat in a healthy way, that we will encourage moderation, and that we will be educated about the effect of our eating habits on our environment. And we have to do a much better job of that, and the government has to do a much better job of that.
So, I mean, I'm just saying, you love cheeseburgers. I mean, we all do. I don't know whether
you know, from time to
try
time,
the
I don't
Beyond
eat them every
Burger,
day,
the Impossible
but yes.
Burger, right? They try, but
Right.
it's not quite the same. That's my personal opinion. But would you support changing the dietary guidelines?
Yes.
You know, the food pyramid, but people
Yes.
to reduce red meat specifically.
Yes, I would. And I'll tell you,
All right, so there you have it. Senator Kamala Harris talking about her platform on basically how we're going to get the American people to eat the way that we deem is appropriate. First of all, who wants this? Is there any voting bloc out there clamoring for the government to control what you put in your mouth? It amazes me that the same side that is saying, get the government out of my uterus, because it's the one argument where they kind of turn to be at least somewhat libertarian on. They're saying, but I do want you controlling what I eat. I would really like it for you to control my sugar intake. I would really like it for you to decrease red meat. And then when asked for clarification from the host there, Kamala Harris says, oh yeah, I think the government should be involved in that. Is there anybody that's looking at that and going, I'd really like to vote for that Kamala Harris? Maybe there are some nut jobs out there that do that, but I've got to believe that alienates at least a large portion of it. One thing that it was a similar vein of thought that went through with Michelle Obama. Now, granted, I wasn't a student when this happened, but my father was a teacher, and I did have a little brother that was still in school at this point. They were starving those poor kids to death because the food that they were offering them, the portion sizes were so small that they were having issues. The football players and some of the other athletes, for example, that needed more food. I mean, they were eating healthy in the sense that they were eating a lot of calories, but then burning it off. That they were having to bring other lunches and bring in food for them because of how little the portion sizes were. Which, by the way, lends itself to the idea that drives this into the ground. The government, especially a far-off government in Washington, cannot decide what is right for an individual. They can't. There are people that I know that eat all the time and eat whatever they want and they stay skinny. It's probably not the best idea, but if that's what they want to do, that's their business. If you want to eat bacon every day and it just doesn't affect you, that's fine. If it does affect you, still fine. If you want to eat every single day, if you want to eat 5,000 calories every single day and blow up to your 400 pounds, that's up to you. Now, you're footing your own doctor bill when they have to put the roof off of your house and pick you up with a crane. That's on you if you're the person that put yourself in that situation. But my point in all of that is that should be to your discretion. It's not smart, but it's up to you. And really, what sort of tickles me on this is that she basically gave the perfect example of why that's a dumb idea. The food pyramid. You ever looked at the food pyramid? Do you realize that, first of all, it's completely screwed up? Because we remember the old food pyramid, that bottom layer, what was it filled with? Carbs, cereal grains. Yeah, well, if you actually structured your diet after the food pyramid, you would get fat. Consuming that level of calories, unless you're incredibly active, you would get fat because of how much carbs you'd be taking in, and some of the stuff that was near the top that you weren't supposed to take in very much of actually was a lot better for you, and people that limited their consumption of that would be a problem. And here's the issue. Science is constantly advancing. And they've upgraded the food pyramid now from the old one when I was a kid. And they've had to change it 3 or 4 times because they constantly are learning new things. The government should not be in charge of what you eat because that's a decision for you, the individual, to make. Because what is essentially being said here is, we, the almighty government, are looking at you, the little people, and have determined that you're just too darn stupid to choose what you want to eat on your own, so we've got to come in and save you from yourself. And this is coming from the same candidate that has said it is her plan to get rid of the filibuster, and has also said that if Congress isn't doing what she wants, then she's just going to write executive orders to do what she wants. This is a person that wants to live like a tyrant. Get rid of Congress, get rid of the filibuster, get rid of all the impediments to me getting what I want and dictating down to you, the peons, the peasants, the unwashed masses. Get rid of everything that's stopping me from doing what I want to you and telling you how to live your life, including how to eat. And if that means we have to nudge you in this direction to do what we think you should do, then so be it. It is absolutely absurd. Sort of in that same line of thinking, let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Okay, right before we get into the chaplain's report for the day, I did want to bring up something that I'm really excited about. Today, I surpassed my goal on funding for the Ukraine mission trip. So for those of you who know me, I'm actually going on a mission trip to the Ukraine really soon. It's going to be sometime next month, and I'll give you notices on that. In fact, it's a month away from tomorrow. So a month from tomorrow, I'll be going to the Ukraine. I'll be gone for an entire week, and of course there will be no shows that week, so you'll be very aware of it if you're in my audience. But this trip is very expensive, and it's very difficult for one person to raise enough money to be able to do that, and so different churches around the state have been giving me money to help fund this. And I would just like to give a special thanks to the 10th Street congregation in Opelika, Alabama, my old church from when I was going to Auburn. Also Tyree Chapel, my grandparents' church up in Kentucky, that they've been funding me, and they've had some very generous donations. And also my grandfather's church in Dadeville, Alabama, the Dadeville Church of Christ. You guys have given above and beyond, all of you. Thank you so much for your contributions, and hopefully this money will be put to good use, and many people out in the Ukraine will hear the gospel for the first time or be convicted in their hearts to obey the gospel because of me going over there. Wish that I could take more credit for that. There's other people that organize it and put me in the right places and plan all of that. So really it's all up to them. But I just wanted to say real quick, thank you so much for helping helping me out with these funds and bringing these to them. Hopefully the gospel will be spread in Eastern Ukraine because of that. And just like the old church in the first century, that we will see the message of Christ going throughout all of these communities in Eastern Europe. But that being said, it is time to go ahead and get into the meat and potatoes of our chaplain's report. And this particular one comes from the book of 1 Samuel. To give you a little context here, Israel has been begging for a king for a while now. Right now they're under the judges system. And so they don't actually have a king. They have various prophets and judges that handle legal matters, and they get fed up with not having a king. Why, I don't know, but they're restless, and they demand of the prophet Samuel that they have a king. And this is that story in 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 8. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like the other nations." But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I have brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Samuel is obviously not happy with Israel, but oddly enough, God reassures him in the most disappointing way that humanly possible. He says, Samuel, this isn't your fault. This isn't something that you've done. The people are the ones at fault. Not because they've rejected you, but because they've rejected me. The whole show today, we've been talking about people that think they know better than everybody else. That think that somebody that just makes decisions for everybody else would be preferable to people making decisions on their own. You see, the whole idea behind the judges system, the whole idea in Israel, is that they had no king. That there were going to be judges to handle disputes to keep them from injuring one another, essentially. But other than that, just left them alone. It's the same thing that Thomas Jefferson talked about in his inaugural address. That the only thing the government's really supposed to do is keep people from hurting one another. But other than that, just kind of leaves them to their own devices. And this is exactly what the idea behind Israel was. You're going to be governed by the law of Moses, and there are going to be priests and judges that help oversee a little bit of that, but ultimately you don't have a king. It's up to you as an individual to serve God in the way that he deemed correct. And that's exactly the same idea that we had behind America. Instead of having a king, instead of having some kind of ruler that tells us what we're going to do, we're going to decide for ourselves, and then one day we will stand before God and answer for our actions. Now, we're going to do that regardless of what form of government we have. But the point is, in America, God's supposed to be the king. Not because we're a theocracy, not because we force it down people's throats, but because this nation says to everybody, you figure it out. You do what you think is best. I don't want a king. I don't want Doug Jones or Kamala Harris or Bernie Sanders or Cory Booker or any of these people to be kings. But you know what else? I also don't want Donald Trump to be king. I don't even want George Washington to be king. No kings. That's what Israel got wrong. They were convinced that if they had somebody controlling their life and telling them what to do, they would be better off. Why? I don't know, but that's what they decided. And eventually, the way that God reacts to this is he tells Samuel, look, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. They don't want me to be king of their life. They want someone else to do it. And that's what's going on here. We have rejected God. We have rejected his proper place as king of our life. And because of that, people are seeking after a worldly power to tell them what to do. It never works out in the end. Just like if you look through the history of the Old Testament, it didn't work out for them either. When they had a human being telling them what to do and how to live, there were a handful of good kings of Judah. There were no good kings in the northern kingdom. And even the best kings, even people like Hezekiah and David, still had massive and obvious moral failings that caused Israel to suffer because they were imperfect. And it really goes back to a quote by C.S. Lewis that I've read I don't know how many times and really influenced my ideas about what government ought to be. And by the way, Lewis and I actually disagree about the form of government that is best because he believed a democracy was better. I don't. But the premise underlying the rationale for how he got there is rock solid. He said, I don't trust a person to have power over his fellow man because I haven't seen anybody that is trustworthy with that kind of power. In other words, it's not that I look out and say, okay, mankind is pretty good, And so they'll be fine governing themselves. That's not the reason he supported the form of government that he did. He realized, just like the Bible states, that the world will reject Christ and the world is going to do evil. What Lewis looked out and said, it's not that I'm saying, oh, people as a whole are good and therefore we should just trust the collective to handle it. That's not what he was saying. He was saying, I don't see any individual that can have the kind of power to control what other people do. And that's why I think a king is a bad idea. If there is one thing that is consistent throughout the scripture, Old Testament, New Testament, you can go all the way back to the days of Samuel and before, you can go all the way forward even into the book of Revelation. The one thing that is consistent is mankind should not have power over one another. The only person that is worthy of that level of loyalty and devotion and obedience is a perfect God. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.